Good Garlic, and thank you to the Labour Party for bringing forward this vitally important motion. Men's violence against women is insidious. It was in January of 2022 that a laughter called this Dáil gathering in a time of great national grief and astonishment at the brutal murder of a young woman at the hands of a violent man to say the words "never again," and use language along the lines of zero tolerance and advanced calls for systematic cultural change. On that occasion, it was Aisling Murphy, a young school teacher brutally slain while simply out for a run at the hands of a violent man. We're now 2 years into the state's promises of zero tolerance, but where are we now? The answer to that is probably best captured by the fact that last week we heard the words "never again" once more. More than that even, the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre have reported receiving the highest number of calls to their helpline in the centre's 45-year history. That figure came just days after Women's Aid revealed that they are receiving more than 40,000 reports of abuse of women and children last year alone, amounting to the highest number in their organisation's 50-year history. But because we know that men's violence against women will not be addressed without men ourselves challenging the culture in which it is allowed to thrive, and this being a point that was made once more this week by Blatnid Raleigh following the sentencing of her attacker, I want to begin by referencing Tom Maher, a man who gave many of us, including myself, the language to better understand the pernicious nature of this endemic that is destroying the lives of women every single day in this country. In Tom Maher's essay, The Monster Myth, which he released on White Ribbon Day in 2012, I believe, he delved into the cultural narrative that depicts rapists and perpetrators of sexual violence as monstrous outliers, fundamentally different from ordinary men. This myth, he argues, serves several harmful purposes. Firstly, it creates a false sense of security amongst the public, who come to believe that only identifiable monsters commit such crimes, and thus allowing ourselves to ignore the fact that most sexual violence or violence against women is perpetrated by seemingly normal men within familiar contexts. And I back that up by using the Women's Aid statistics once again, that 1 in 4 women in Ireland who have been in relationships have been abused by a current or a former partner, or the 35,570 disclosures of abuse against women and the 4,478 disclosures of abuse against children to advance that belief that is not just the monsters we see in the paper. In that same essay, Maher draws from a tragic personal experience, noting how the man who raped and murdered his wife Jill, an Irish citizen who was living in Australia, was initially perceived by both himself and the public as a monstrous figure. This reaction, while understandable in its emotional immediacy, ultimately obscures the reality that sexual violence is deeply embedded into everyday social structures and attitudes. And it is by relegating the perpetrators to the realm of the monstrous, society absolves ourselves of the responsibility to examine and change the cultural norms and the systematic issues that foster environments where such violence can occur. This myth of the monster allows society at large to absolve ourselves of the collective culpability by finding some aspect of the perpetrator that we can use as to individualise the rotten fruit from the poison orchard in which we all reside. In the case of Aisling Murphy, it was the nationality of the attacker that was focused on initially. On so many other occasions, such as the tragic murder of Clodagh Haw, we first have to hear that a man who murdered his wife and children was, and I quote, a community man who snapped, or we had to learn about his mental health to the point that his destruction of a woman's life becomes secondary to the reason for which he done it. And last week, and through the courage of Natasha O'Brien, who I acknowledge in the gallery, it was the perpetrator's profession that was focused on in narratives. I was somewhat disappointed. I suppose it's understandable in certain contexts that with a Taoiseach was stamped forward and talked about the armed services and said we are going to root violence against women out of our armed services, but given somewhat the impression that it's okay everywhere else because those Women's Aid statistics and the Rape Crisis Centre statistics suggest that this is far, 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 far more insidious. That if we're going to root out the armed forces and have a zero tolerance, presumably we must also go much, much deeper and root it out of all of society. This myth prevents meaningful progress in addressing sexual violence and violence against women because it directs attention away from the more common and insidious forms of male violence that permeate society. There must be a call for a reframing of the issue, urging a focus on the ways in which ordinary men are conditioned to exert power and control, often through subtle and socially accepted forms of aggression. We must also see how the justice system and the media can, in some places, perpetuate this monster myth. Sensationalised portrayals of violent criminals reinforce the notion that such individuals are fundamentally different from the average person, and it thereby neglects the broader spectrum of behaviours and attitudes that contribute to a culture of violence. And there is a culture of violence here, and it is drawn out in those figures that are devastating from the Women's Aid and the Rape Crisis Centre. That culture was best encapsulated in that horrific phrase, and I'm sorry for using it once again, two to put her down, two to put her out. We talk about the courage of Natasha O'Brien, and that courage began when she intervened in the homophobic abuse that was being levelled at a person walking along the street. That intervention then proceeded to a vicious assault on herself, while other men simply watched on. The perpetrator of that crime then took to social media to brag about it, in absolutely no danger, or felt in no danger of what we were saying would be called out. And of course, we must want and we must demand harsher sentences for a crime of that depravity. But I am equally terrified of the culture in which a person like that was enabled, and what we must do to stop the next ones from emerging. Zero tolerance should be a minimum expectation, but we must go deeper, much deeper, and call for a shift in societal perspective. We must recognise the ordinariness of perpetrators and the everyday cultural practices that support gendered violence. We must seek to dismantle the monster myth. Society can begin to do this by addressing the root causes of sexual violence and work towards creating safer and more equitable communities. There's a number of different suggestions which have been made in terms of how we do that. I personally believe that that must start in early years education, it must start in our schools, in our secondary schools. We still don't have an effective relationships and sex education program in our schools. We still don't have effective ethics courses. We do not have, and this is a call that's being made by principals for the length and breadth of this country, effective psychological support or counselling services in our school to address trauma, but also to combat the toxic culture in which young people are emerging into a society that is changing, evolving fast, but yes, the culture of violence against women permeates. I spent most of my time talking about confronting that monster myth culture. That shouldn't take away from the responsibility of the state, and there's a number of ways in which the state is failing. Refuge centres are still, we still have 9 counties without effective refuge centres. We don't have appropriate data. I listened to Blotnet rally this morning, and I've joined the protest that Natasha was leading. The courage I can't begin to comprehend. But we must also acknowledge that we seek to protect anonymity for those women who are victims of crime, and choose that that's not the best approach suited to their needs, and seek to protect that anonymity while still advancing harsher sentences. We need ombudsmen for victims. The Judicial Council was already talked about.
I call now on the people for profit.
Thank you, Carla.